Okay, so today on the Plant Cutting Podcast, we have Ben LeVine from Rasa. He is an herbalist and an entrepreneur, and we're excited to speak with him today. So, Ben, how are you?
I'm great. And hi, Isaac and AC. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, it's
Yeah,
good
I'm
to have
excited.
you.
So, generally, when we do these interviews, the first question is, what brought you to the plant path? So,
Hmm. Yeah, I was really lucky to grow up on 5 acres in rural Arizona. The rural Arizona thing maybe is not so lucky, but 5 acres was awesome. We had a little orchard, maybe 10 apple trees, 5 pear trees, a big veggie garden. And that was a lot of my time as a kid was spent either doing chores outside. We had chickens and goats, and it was like a little homestead. And so I was doing them as chores, but somehow something about the outside got inside of me. And we also go hiking quite a bit. The Chiricahua National Monument was fairly near the house, and that was my start. But I really was interested in food justice and food systems, and I didn't discover herbalism till my early 20s. After college, I was working on an organic farm in Alaska, and it was just so different than the landscapes I was used to. It's so green and lush, and so many wild foods were out there. Like I remember the first time we saw nettles and fiddlehead ferns and a lot of mushrooms, and that kind of excitement about the wild, the potency in the wild that's just a little different than the cultivated crops was what snagged me. And then from there, I went to Colorado after traveling abroad for a bit, and ended up at the Colorado School of Clinical Herbalism, and then did some further education at the Maryland University of Integrative Health. So it's been, yeah, a pretty meandering path, but uh, the early days of feeling connected to nature, and then in Alaska being like, what, we can eat things that are just growing out on the hiking trails, really what sunk it in for me.
cool. Yeah. And then I saw that you worked at Celestial Seasonings, basically, and that seems to have impacted your further development. Do you want to share a little
Yeah.
bit just about that?
Yes, absolutely. I Celestial Seasonings, I was there for 4 years, and it was really a big inflection point for my path in a lot of ways, in good ways and bad ways. I I moved to Boulder, Colorado, Arapaho Ute Cheyenne territory, uh, a little bit after college, a couple years after college, and was looking for a job. I kind of wanted to farm. I didn't really know what I wanted to do. I had a bit of a business background, and I got a job as a assistant purchasing temporary purchasing assistant at Celestial Seasonings in the herb department. It was two folks that had been there for 40 years and had traveled all over the world doing supply chain explorations. And it was awesome. And I was starting to develop an interest in herbs, but this happened at the same time in a way that was so synchronous. Like I got to take all these herbs home with me and start playing around with them. And it was also my key into herb school, because I convinced Celestial Seasonings to pay for evening herb school at the Colorado School here
Nice.
It's the way to do
in
it.
town. Yeah. And I got to see the herb industry in a
Yeah.
way that very few people have the privilege to. Like I was buying 10 million pounds of herbs a year, which is just massive.
Yeah.
And
I
and
can't even
and
imagine
seeing,
it. Yeah.
yeah, it was like I was buying 1 million pounds of chamomile a year, from Mexico and Egypt, and sometimes Eastern Europe, and like getting to know these plants from the commerce side, as
Mhm.
well as in herb school, and trying them out on my own, and also seeing a lot of as someone who kind of grew up with organic being a really big deal, and working on a permaculture farm, and I traveled to India before I landed in Colorado and worked on some farms there. Um, Seeing the herb industry at that scale and not being in a position to do anything that felt particularly good or useful. It was just kind of almost status quo in a lot of ways at Celestial Seasonings. Like we would launch organic products here and there, but it wasn't built into the ethos of the company. And that was a big part of my drive to join Rasa. It was like, oh, now I have all this experience. I've done a lot of sourcing internationally. I understand R&D and quality control and operations, but now I can be in control instead of this. I think Hain Celestial's $3.5 billion. So
Wow.
it's just a very different experience than the small startup I'm at now.
Yeah.
For sure. So I have a bunch of questions popping around in my brain, but I did want to go back to the food justice part. And I'm curious, like, how that piqued, that interest in food justice peaked for you.
Yeah, it showed up in a lot of ways. I was in this really incredible dumpster diving co-op in college, like really
Nice.
organized. It was probably 30 of us, and a couple times a month you would go out with a partner, and we had a little map of all the good dumpsters around. I was living in Tucson at the time.
Oh,
so like, all right, we're gonna hit Whole Foods, we're gonna hit Trader Joe's, we're gonna hit Sprouts, and we had this whole map for folks.
Nice.
And then you drop it off at another person's house, who, and again, it would be a pair, and they would sort it into 20 different boxes and then deliver it. So you'd wake up the next morning with a box of food. Twice a week, you had a box of food.
It's like a dumpster CSA.
Yeah, it was incredible.
That's really cool. I love that idea.
But just little things like that, just realizing how much waste. I saw a number recently, something like 40% of our food is wasted. And I think the righteous anger that comes with those type of statistics, and also growing up, my dad was a organic gardener, and that was always a big part of our household, and just understanding more about that and reading more about what's happening when we monoculture. And there's so many things wrong with our system, so it just kept popping out in any way it could.
Yeah. So one
really
of the
cool.
Yeah, that is really, really cool. I know what you mean, like looking, like when I've found, for instance, like 50 pounds of brie in the dumpster, I'm like, yes, hell yeah. But then also, like, that's just 50 pounds of really good food that's just going to go to waste unless somebody uses it. But the amount of food that's just thrown away, ends up in landfills, is ridiculous.
And the amount of hungry people, it just does not compute.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'm happy just on the dumpster diving piece, like Boulder, for instance, like there are solutions starting to be put in place where it's not just poor college kids going around, but there's a whole system where it's above ground. No one's getting arrested. It's all on bikes, and people just volunteers pick up food from different grocery stores and take it to shelters and other folks who need the food. And that's beautiful. Like any amount of underground dumpster diving that I'd want to do is useless in a place like Boulder. But that's not always the case.
Yeah,
for sure.
So you moved on to Rasa after Celestial Seasonings, which is a completely different scenario. And I see all the bags behind you. And I know Rasa is known for like adaptogens and like coffee substitutes and so on. I've been seeing ads on Facebook and so on. But one of the things that I thought would be interesting to talk with you about, because we talked about this a little bit previously via email, is the connection between vital energy and adaptogens. And that's something that I'm really interested in, because like all throughout the world, there are various names for vital energy. And in the West, there are actually dozens of names for vital energy, from orgone to vital energy to etheric energy or whatever. But, there's chi, there's prana. But it's not allowed in the Western worldview, but it's recognized all over the world. It's a real phenomenon. It might not be as easily measurable by science, but it is real. And the idea that plants can help you cultivate that is kind of appealing. So what's your opinion on vital energy and adaptogens?
Well, I think you're exactly right. There's this force that I think pretty much every culture in the world is recognized in some form or another, but we can't measure it in the West. And so it often gets pushed under the rug or not recognized, or it's not real. But the fascinating thing for me is that you see this tie across cultures, as you said, chi, prana. The Greek called it pneuma, the true energy that flows from the heart. And all these systems also had language around what happens when that chi or vitality gets compromised. And they know how it gets compromised. If it's acute shock, intense emotions, chronic overstimulation, whether it's physical, mental, work, and they have language around what that manifestation looks like. It's low energy, it's depression, it's lack of mental clarity. It affects systems like immune function. And that almost perfectly describes what we talk about so often today when we talk about burnout, chronic fatigue. And so they map really well on top of each other. But these traditions had herbs that they used to help nurture and support this vitality. Whether it's the chi tonics in traditional Chinese medicine or the rasayanas in Ayurveda in India, there were herbs that helped kind of restore vitality. And what gets even crazier for me is that a lot of these herbs across cultures have shared chemistry. So it's not just these cultures in isolation saying, like this herb seems to help for vitality. There's a certain way these herbs help with vitality that they were able to recognize. And you look at some of the chi tonics that are now considered adaptogens. Adaptogens is a modern word. And in China, and you look at some of the rasayanas in Ayurveda, and you're like, wow, they share triterpenoid saponins, one of the main compounds that's fairly common across the group of adaptogenic herbs. And these compounds do a lot of things to help restore our vitality, and they often work through the stress response. They look almost identical to cortisol, it seems, looking at some research on ginseng, on ginsenosides, which are also triterpenoid saponins, it seems like they work as partial agonists. So they bind like cortisol, but not as strongly. And that explains this bidirectional effect where if you have a ton of cortisol coursing through your bloodstream, like many of us do with chronically elevated stress, the adaptogens can lower cortisol. And we see, research now coming out with that, like ashwagandha lowers cortisol significantly. And on the flip side, if you have no cortisol, you've entered that exhaustive, total burnt out. Like I now have a cortisol equivalent of insulin resistance, and my cortisol is plummeted. Adaptogens can come in with these triterpenoid saponins and give you a little bit of a boost and plug into those receptors in a way that can help you start to build better habits back in.
Yeah, that's really interesting.
So you're saying that different herbs from different cultures contain the same constituents?
Yeah, triterpenoid, though there's a couple constituents that are common across a lot of these adaptogenic tonic herbs. Triterpenoid saponins is one of the main ones, and the one that looks like cortisol. Ginsenosides in ginseng are triterpenoid saponins. Some of the eleutherosides in eleutherol, some of the tangstenosides in Cotinopsis, some of the gepenosides in jagulan or gynostemma. All of these are triterpenoid saponins. And so you see this cultural understanding of, these herbs are good for building back vitality. And then you see it on the chemical side as well, which just blows my mind that you can tie these things together. And it's not always the case, but this class of compounds is found in a remarkable amount of the adaptogens.
Cool. So I guess adaptogens is kind of a big category and is a little still vague. And so you've named several herbs that I'm familiar with and I are considered adaptogens, but there's also herbs like reishi or tulsi do that are considered adaptogens. Do those have similar compounds too, or like how do you define an adaptogen?
Yeah, that's good. That's a really good question. I'll start with reishi. The kind of that shiny shellac on the top of reishi,
Mm-hmm.
those are terpenes, and
Mm.
there are triterpenoid saponins in there, and that's what gives reishi its adaptogenic properties. It has a lot of those immunomodulating beta glucans common across most medicinal mushrooms. And those aren't giving the adaptogenic properties. It's why many mushrooms like chaga, not an adaptogen, awesome mushroom, but not an adaptogen. But reishi is an adaptogen because it has those triterpenoid saponins in the hard top. Yeah, and the you bring up a really good point. Adaptogen, we're afraid, it could easily become just another word for superfood, meaning absolutely nothing.
Right.
Like it's
Right.
in very real danger of that. You see a lot of marketers calling anything and everything adaptogenic. It's clearly a buzzword right now. It's becoming more and more popular, and like there is no standardized definition that's enforced. There's a standard definition that the folks who do adaptogenic research follow. It started as the 3 Ns. The herb has to be non-toxic at normal doses, normalizing in its effect, not one directional. It has to bring things back into balance, and non-specific. So it's not building resistance to one very specific type of influence or stressor. It's more of a general resilience. And then more recently, in the last decade or so, a 4th N has been added, or a 4th part of the definition. It has to work through the stress response system, the HPA axis, or the SAS, the sympathoadrenal system. So it has to work through the neuroendocrine system. So you can look at a mushroom like chaga, for instance, and say, like chaga is amazing. It's non-toxic. It's normalizing for things like the immune system, but it doesn't work through the neuroendocrine system in the stress response in a way that adaptogens do.
Yeah, because I guess like nettle also could be, it's non-toxic, it's normalizing,
Yeah.
but it doesn't work through the
Yeah.
neuroendocrine system. Do you think you could talk a little bit about the neuroendocrine system and like what it is?
Yeah. So our stress response has 2 main pathways. One is more hormone based in the endocrine system, and one is more nervous system based. And when you combine them, it becomes the neuroendocrine system. But on the hormone side, you have the HPA axis, which is your brain, like there's something stressful out there, and you start sending these hormone signals from the hypothalamus to the pituitary to the adrenals to the adrenal cortex, which releases cortisol. And this is one of the, you're also releasing other things as well, but cortisol is kind of the main thing that the adrenal cortex is releasing. And it's called the stress hormone. On the other side, you have the sympathoadrenal system, which is working through the nervous system instead of the hormone cascade. And you're telling your adrenal medulla to release compounds, including adrenaline. And so you have adrenaline and cortisol. Adrenaline is much more fast acting. It's also quicker to clear the body, but it gives you that first kind of umph, like we're getting ready to fight or flee. And then cortisol comes in after that and provides a lot of the sustained elevated energy. There's a lot of things going on, like sugar is becoming more available in the bloodstream, so you're able to mobilize energy, get glucose to your muscles, and the stress response is amazing. It's something we've evolutionarily had for forever, what we've never really had is chronic stress. You think of, I don't know if you have deer in central New York, but we have a lot of deer in Colorado.
Yeah, we got deer.
Okay. So like just watching them, sometimes you start to understand how the nervous system should work. You know, they will freak out, and then a minute later, it's like nothing ever happened. Like they're just peacefully munching grass, forgot about everything. And that's how like our system should be working. We see a mountain lion, we're like, okay, like we're fighting, we're fleeing, but then it's over, and we go back to the fire, we go back to rest and digest, or feed and breed, or whatever you want to call the opposite of fight or flight. But today we often have this just constant, you know, whether it's really stressful work and emails, or it's just our general environment, traffic, a lot of just basic needs that are expanding in a way that makes us chronically anxious and chronically stressed. And the cortisol that's released from our stress response just keeps getting released. And what is initially awesome, like we couldn't run 2 miles without cortisol because our knees would be killing us from all the inflammation. And cortisol also wakes us up in the morning. The part of the circadian rhythm is, you know, cortisol waking us up in the morning. But as soon as you get out of this sort of rhythmic resetting pattern that we should have with stress, and it becomes chronic, you have chronically elevated cortisol, which then I like to think of it like a highway. Sometimes the ambulance or the police car, like they are coming down the highway, everyone pulls over, they pass, you get back on the highway, the healthcare worker goes to the hospital, the teacher goes to the school, the construction guys are working on the infrastructure. But chronic stress looks like just rows and rows of ambulances, and everyone else is just stalled on the side. And our immunity starts suffering, our libido suffers, our mood suffers, our sleep suffers. And that's kind of the state of chronic stress that we're in today, many of us.
Yeah.
I love that whole visual and how you explained all of that. So thank you for sharing. So what do we do with this chronic stress? Like how do we deal in a modern society, you know, with these elevated cortisone levels and these roads full of ambulances in our body? What do we do with all this?
It's such a present question, and there's so many different ways to answer it. And so I'll answer it from the herbal way that I'm working in. I think one part of the question that I always ask is what's contributing to the stress. And when you look at, I know there are many coffee drinkers out there. Most of America's coffee drinkers, but so I'm not going to bash on coffee too hard, but it could be said that coffee doesn't help stress. There's some interesting research. If you're not habituated to coffee and you have a cup of coffee, it triggers your stress response like crazy. Your cortisol goes through the roof. And the idea was that once you're habituated to coffee, that no longer happens, because now coffee has replaced your morning cortisol bump in a way, and you're just drinking coffee to get back to your normal baseline. But it seems that it still is elevating cortisol, not quite as much as when you're having your first cup, but every morning you're giving yourself a little bit of that stress response. And so that's one thing we've been thinking a lot about, like, our culture is, our baseline consciousness as a culture is a drink that helps put us in a state of stress. And how has that impacted our culture as a whole? And that was a big part of the idea behind Rasa, is like, let's offer plants that help regulate stress, put a ceiling on the amount of stress we're feeling, and also try and just plug and play with this ritual that 90% of Americans do every morning. It's an easy way to build a ritual, build a habit, because you already have one. And I've tried to take capsules and tinctures, and sometimes I'm really successful, and sometimes I just like, how do I remember to take, my magnesium every day?
Mm-hmm.
Still working on that one. But when you plug it into a ritual like coffee, it's much easier.
So what is it about coffee that triggers the cortisol response? And is it the same? Like, is it caffeine? Does it happen with tea too? Like,
Black
camellia tea? Yeah.
Yeah, it's a combination of things, and it's kind of crazy. We don't fully know how coffee works. Like we've been drinking coffee as a species for a long time, but there are so many compounds in coffee, and we know the basics. We know how adenosine, how it blocks adenosine, which is our kind of down regulating compound. As we go through our day, we're using ATP to make energy, adenosine triphosphate. Adenosine is a almost a waste product that builds up in our system and says like, hey, we're tired. And when adenosine reaches a certain level, we go to sleep. And caffeine looks almost identical to adenosine. But instead of a partial agonist, like we were talking about with adaptogens, it's an antagonist, which means it kind of blocks that receptor like a bodyguard, and the adenosine can't bind to the adenosine receptors, and our body thinks we're not tired. But that's not why we're getting the stress response. One of the reasons is coffee is a pretty big central nervous system stimulant. There's also some thought around, the question of like, why do we get so euphoric when we drink a cup of coffee? Like, it can't purely be blocking adenosine, because that's not adding anything. It's just making us not feel tired. And there are dopamine receptors next to adenosine receptors, a certain type of dopamine receptor that appears to also be getting triggered with the caffeine and making us feel good. And that might be part of it as well. But mostly the central nervous system stimulation, I guess.
I see. Yeah. So I mean, I don't drink coffee. I can't, it like hurts my stomach. So I haven't been drinking it for a number of years. But I do like the mushroom powder type thing, and as a plug and play, because everyone has, well, most people in the United States have that kind of a ritual. So it is good to use established rituals. But it also makes me think, like every culture kind of has their drug,
Yeah.
Like in the Middle Ages, Europe was just drunk all the time.
Yep.
Well, because water supply wasn't.
Well, I mean, there's reasons, but
right.
we got to have something.
Yeah,
but
we have
it's
sugar
true.
in coffee.
Yeah. Like what drugs do our cultures condone? And we have a shrine to coffee in every office, and
We
we
really
hate on other
do.
plants, but like, we have our plants, and it is really interesting. Like, am I just really stupid to go up against something so embedded in our culture?
No,
like,
I
maybe.
love it. I freaking love it, because it's like, it's a really smart move from an herbalist perspective who wants to change culture, change, the world, to like go at the at coffee, or like at the addictive, the major addiction that this country has that's not serving us, and replacing it with something that does serve us. Because it's like, anyone who's ever tried to get off of an addiction, it's not easy to just go cold turkey, to just quit. But if you have something that you can replace it with, like you were saying, the morning ritual of having that first sip of coffee and like making your coffee, if you can replace that with something similar but more nourishing, it makes a lot of sense. So I think that it's like a noble cause, and it's a really good idea. Because like, not only is like the coffee industry, not promoting our individual health, but where are we getting the coffee from? And like Maxwell House, and like, how is it contributing to climate change and to, problems, in people's lives across the world? It's just like,
coffee's actually 6th on the list. I mean, beef number 1 by a large degree of contributing to climate change, like the foods we eat, and coffee's number 6.
Wow.
So it's not, I mean, it's a lot of transportation. It's often sun grown and monocropped, and there's a lot of beautiful people doing beautiful work, intercropping, shade grown. But the majority of the coffee out there is,
Exactly.
it's not in a great way. And it's so fascinating for me. Have either of you read Dale Pendel's books?
Yeah.
If anyone listening, Dale Pendel is one of the coolest plant poets, the late Dale Pendel. But he writes a lot about plants and culture, and how, just like you were saying, Isaac, how plants weave themselves into culture in such a strong way. And when you really step back and look at our relationship with coffee, it's really interesting. Like, you see a lot of t-shirts and mugs that say, coffee is my personality, or don't talk to me until I have 2 cups of coffee.
Yeah.
And if we subbed in coffee for anything else, if we were like, vodka is my personality, don't talk to me till I've had 2 glasses of wine, like,
wow,
you would be like, like, I don't know if that's healthy relationship.
that's true.
Right. Well, it's also interesting on so there's a channel I watched on YouTube, Nordic Animism. So he's coming at things from an animist perspective, and he was discussing how the ancient Norse people used beer as a ritual of coming together, and as you made offerings with beer to the spirits of the land and so on. And the same kind of thing was happening in North America with tobacco, for instance. Like, that would be the plant that causes some changes in consciousness, but is like, you share it together, to have a peace talk. You offer it to the spirits of the land or whatever, or other plants, whatever you're doing. But then our culture has kind of taken that to terrible. Like, I'm sure tobacco is up there too on the list of crops that are causing problems. But it's the way our relationship with it. But
that's a really, really beautiful point. And I was in Ethiopia for a couple of weeks, maybe 9 years ago, and that's where coffee's from. Like, that's the birthplace of coffee. And the first thing I noticed, like, wow, there's very little. You can make coffee extremely strong, and there's very little of that, like, bitter, acidic, and it's like, the terroir, like, the soil in Ethiopia is not as acidic as it is other places coffee has been brought. And then the second thing was like, there's an entire ceremony built around coffee, and you're gonna sit down for a couple hours, and it has steps, it has rules, it has community. And like, imagine if that was the only way we could get coffee in America. Like, it would be a really different picture.
Yeah, that's true. And I mean, the same thing with like chocolate and all these other plants. Like, when you take it out of the ceremonial context, you desacralize it, and it becomes something that can be a problem,
a commodity.
But to go back to replacing, they're using the already established ritual of coffee, that track is already in place, that habit is already formed. And a mentor of mine once told me that you can't break habits, you can't break addictions, you can only trade up. So, I think adaptogenic herbs is probably a trade up. I would say. Yeah,
I like that. I like that. And I'm aware of how easily adaptogens can also get co-opted by our culture.
Right.
It's not hard to replace your cup of coffee with a shot of really intense ginseng extract, and not get, maybe there's some harm reduction, yes, but like, is it good for you? I don't know. And so that's something we talk about a lot at Rasa. Like, how do we, like, a lot of our, like, the base adaptogens we use are the more nourishing, gentle, like Codonopsis, Shatavari, Maca, and then you have the option of going into the more intense, like here's a blend that has a nice dose of rhodiola and eleuthero and schizandra, but the challenge is to communicate to people and say like, oh yeah, like you won't feel it like coffee, but give it a couple weeks and then tell us how it is, and tell us how your energy is, and tell us how you feel.
And have you ever seen adaptogenic herbs becoming kind of a crutch for people, where they work so well that they don't make important lifestyle changes, like maybe quitting that job or getting out of a shitty relationship or something?
Yeah, definitely. And that's that's like, adaptogens can't replace good relationships and exercise and nutrition and all of that, and spiritual practice. And I use this, it's a story, Betsy Castillo Miller, I learned from her. She was talking about and this kind of just a animal graphic segment coming up, just a warning, but a lot of the early research, a lot of research still, unfortunately, is what's called forced swim tests, where they put mice in a bucket of water and they see how long they swim until they give up and drown. And they will swim longer with adaptogens. But if you're not building a ladder out of that bucket, like, what are you doing? And so always asking clients and customers, like, how are you using adaptogens to build a ladder out of that bucket? Because if you're just using them to struggle longer, or to, over optimize longer, or to overstretch yourself longer, like, it's not going to be good for you. Like it might be better than other things you could be doing, but it's not the way.
It's quite the visual.
Yeah. I think that's why it stuck with me. I say that all the time to students when I teach, and I mean, it's just like so visceral. And so, like, I'll just say it again, it's like it's incredibly messed up that we use animals in this way.
For sure.
Horrible.
So to go back to a previous question, talking about adaptogens and like vital energy, when we go back in time to most traditional cultures, that most of the people aren't in fight or flight stress response most of the time, like a lot of people in like the West, industrialized West, are. So what was the use of the adaptogens at that time? And I know that many have associations with spiritual practice. For instance, reishi, is called the spiritual mushroom, and you're only supposed to use it if you're gonna get enlightened or something. I mean, it's a reduction, but
that's a really good one. And it's an interesting thing that we do, lumping herbs into categories like adaptogens. And it's awesome that they have shared chemistry and they have shared categorization in traditional cultures, like chi tonics and rasayanas, but they also have very unique individual personalities, and I think that plays into a lot of their use. Like take ashwagandha, for instance. It's a rasayana in Ayurveda, so it is known to help build up vitality when you are weak, when you're convalescent, like when you need some extra support. Ashwagandha is great, and it also has a lot of very specific indications, around fertility. There's some immune things, and you see this with each herb. Like, okay, Codonopsis, called poor man's ginseng because it's a lot cheaper than ginseng. It has a lot of the same ginsenoside type compounds, but it was often added to soups in the winters because it's a tonic, it's fortifying, it's really helpful for the immune system. And same with the astragalus. And so there's a mix of specific indication, like, I have this problem, I'm going to take this herb. But there's also, on the other side, herbs just weaving into daily life in a way that we don't often experience here. Tulsi, I was in India in March, and it was really beautiful to see Tulsi everywhere. You know, it's a one of their most sacred plants.
Yeah, it's a goddess.
And
Yeah.
yeah, it's the manifestation of a goddess. And it was at every house we went to. And you're like, there's your Tulsi plant in this beautiful planter, like this just incredible altar of a pot. And then we would go to a farm and be like, there's the farmer's Tulsi in his outside of his house. And we'd go to our supplier, and they would have a little Tulsi shrine at the entrance to their office. And you know, like how that weaves in, and you know, like drinking Tulsi every day is a beautiful thing. And obviously there's a lot of very specific indications, but it was also a drink. It is also a drink that's quite popular in India. I could Shazandra.
Yeah.
There's a indigenous group, the Nanai, in the Far East, that would eat Shazandra berries for hunting because it helped give them energy, staved off hunger, reportedly gave night vision, which I haven't tested, but
we have to try that out.
Night vision, yeah.
Noted.
Rhodiola was consumed in a bottle of vodka in Siberia all winter to help immunity and energy. A bouquet of rhodiola roots was given at weddings.
Wow.
To kind of to, you know, boost the happiness of the couple and help foster fertility. And so like the richness of the cultural use is just absolutely mind-blowing. And I only know a small fraction of it, but I want to understand it more.
Well, I feel like there's also a kind of a big difference in terms of the kind of stress that industrialized Western people have, whereas traditional culture, like we live down the street from some Amish folks, and I like, you know, I drive them around sometimes, and you know, we know them. They don't have the kind of fight or flight, you know, stress response, that chronic stress that most many Westerners have. But they also, like, they're working all the time.
They have like adrenal fatigue.
Yeah, they're under physical stress.
Yeah,
like when you're in a more subsistence lifestyle, which most people in the world have like always been, you know, because they haven't been subsidized by fossil fuels, basically. You still face stress. It's just not more. I guess I kind of see that Western one is more cerebral stress, or more. It's a different kind of stress, I guess.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And yeah, I agree. A lot of our stress starts mentally and manifests very physically, but I'm like, I'm sitting in front of a computer for 8 hours. My body's like, run.
Yeah.
But I'm just gonna sit here.
Yeah.
As opposed to being really, really active and not feeling as much of that mental pressure, but working extremely hard. And a lot of these herbs can also help. Ashwagandha, for instance, you know, there's a lot of research around performance and endurance and extending the physicality, our ability to be physical. So you know, there's some application there as well.
Yeah. So I guess I'm curious. You mentioned you were in India recently. What brought you to India this time around?
I was in India 8-9 years ago for 4 months or so, working on farms and just kind of backpacking around. And this time I went to visit a few suppliers. We buy quite a few things from India: ashwagandha, shatavari, vanilla, rose petals, rose powder, cardamom, ginger. Soon to be cloves and black pepper. So we buy a lot from India, and I have been wanting to go for a while. COVID stopped me for a couple of years. And so I was there primarily to build relationships with our suppliers. I visited a new supplier, and also just to have understanding. You don't really know what's going on over there until you visit any supplier anywhere. Getting your eyes on the equipment they're using, the setup they have, meeting farms and farmers, and understanding how the farmers are set up and what they're doing and what they need help with. So I was there on a fact finding mission, and just to see like what's the situation here.
Very cool. So that brings up a question about sustainability and herbs. And as the person who's sourcing the herbs for your company, and you actually claim that your herbs are obsessively, is that what you say? Obsessively sustainable. So what does that mean? How do you keep it sustainable?
Yeah, there's two different sides. I'll talk about one, and then I'll talk about the other. And it's cultivated and wild. So India is a great example of the cultivated. Like I was there to like understand like how are farmers pushing forward things like organic and regenerative, and now what can we do to continue to move in that direction and support them. And it was really beautiful to see just the amount of work they're doing on their land and their soils. For instance, there's this, it's called Jivamrutha, which translates to nectar of life. And it's basically a traditional compost tea. You have the indigenous cow dung and urine, a handful of soil, some lentil flour, and some jaggery, which is unrefined sugar. And you let it ferment, and the microbes from the urine and the dung and the soil feed on the jaggery and the lentil, and it just becomes this incredibly microbe-rich solution that they then dilute and spray in their fields.
Cool.
And I saw like a buttermilk version of this as well, and saw a lot of vermicomposting at really large scale. Like this, when I was in India previously, almost a decade ago, I was working on a Masanobu Fukuoka inspired permaculture farm, like no till, a lot of the natural farming methods, and was really inspired. But I was like, how does this scale? This feels like a demo farm. And so it was cool to see this time, like, okay, this supplier has 2,000 organic farmers. They average 2 to 4 acres, and they're doing a lot of amazing work with green manuring and intercropping and rainwater catchment. And how do we expand this, and understanding how, what motivates the farmers to do that, how they're like, for instance, let's say there's one model farmer in a village doing a lot of these practices, and other farmers start to see like, wow, like this guy has better soil, better yield, better profit. And then they start to ask him like, hey, can you show me how you did your rainwater catchment? Can you show me how you intercrop or vermicompost? And so that was really awesome to see. And supporting more and more of the cultivation efforts around the world. In Jordan, for instance, we buy roasted date seed, the original coffee alternative before coffee was even drank by humans.
Huh.
Roasted date seeds have been consumed for a long time in the Middle East. But we paid for their first year of organic certification, and they're the first organic roasted date seed supplier in the world, which is really awesome to see. And it was just mostly us saying like, we're interested in this, and we're willing to show you that we're invested in this partnership.
Nice.
And then on the wild side, it's kind of scary out there in some ways. As herbs like adaptogens get more and more popular, it's really easy for them to start leaning into that commodity category. And when you talk about wild plants, like there's always a finite amount in the ground.
Yeah.
Right.
And we've seen this, chaga it's not an adaptogen, but it's one that we thought about very early on in the company. We were using wild chaga, and we start reading, there's a Dale Rogers, Roger, yeah, I think Dale Rogers on the United Plant Savers blog has a whole article about chaga and sustainability issues, and how a lot of herbalists on the East Coast and West Coast are starting to see less and less chaga as it becomes more and more popular. And we switched to cultivated. Like we use fruiting body mushrooms for every mushroom we use, except now chaga for the last 3 years is mycelium, just because there is no way we want to be on the wrong side of history with wild chaga. And we see this with other adaptogens too. Rhodiola, for instance, is now known to be over-harvested. When 4 years ago, when Rasa started, we were buying from China. And I went to China 3 years ago, up into the wild nature preserve many of our herbs are sourced from. And I saw eleuthero, which was really beautiful. I saw a lot of other herbs, but I never saw rhodiola.
Oh yeah.
And it's a real problem now. The government's putting quotas on it. There's a meeting happening, I think maybe within the next month, about adding it to CITES, like the more controlled trading of rhodiola. And same thing is happening with eleuthero to a lesser degree, but it's coming. And so we're trying to be ahead of the curve and educate more. And we started sourcing from Canada, cultivated rhodiola, which is really nice. And slowly working on getting eleuthero potentially fair wild certified, which would bring accountability to harvesting. You can only harvest this many plants per square hectare. So there's a lot of problems in the herb industry, and there's a lot of really amazing people working on them. And Ambrecht with the sustainable herbs program is a big part of that, and I'm part of the working group there, which is tackling these massive issues of like, how do we bring an herbalist mindset to global trade? Like that's the like I could talk about all these case studies, but it all boils down to, like, as an herbalist, I have a very different relationship with the herbs I wildcraft in the mountains at home. Like it is a courtship. It is a real relationship. It is an honoring. And how do I translate that to international trade, and how do I bring love into the supply chain? And I'm really honored to be part of the herb industry, because that's something many folks in the herb industry are talking about that you don't see in many other industries, but it's still still a far cry from being there.
Yeah, you start out, I guess, as an herbalist, like building these personal relationships with plants, and like you said, like honoring them, connecting with them in the wild. And you can't really forget that as you build your business, and as you like are a part of the industry. So it doesn't surprise me that herbalists are talking about that in a large scale. And I'm wondering if, like, with the increased demand for adaptogens, like, is there enough supply? Like, do we just simply not have enough right now? Like, do we need to be like doubling down on like growing, more adaptogens? And do we need to be just like focusing on sourcing the herbs that we definitely can do safely, and like leaning on these like more common wilds and easily cultivated herbs, and like the rhodiolas and the things that are, rare and increasingly rare?
There's a cycle, it seems, where you start with wild, it gets really popular, it starts to become a little more scarce, price starts to go up, adulteration starts to go up, and then cultivation efforts start to happen. And that's what we saw with rhodiola. Like, rhodiola price from China and Russia has probably doubled in the last 5 years, from my limited exposure to it. There's a lot of adulteration in the rhodiola industry because there's so many rhodiolas. Like we have a rhodiola in the Rockies in Colorado. It doesn't have the medicinal effect, but you could mix it in with rhodiola rosea if you wanted to, and that started to pop up a lot. And then cultivation efforts are starting, but it's a long process because rhodiola has never really been cultivated before. In the wild, it can take 20 years for a root to mature. In cultivation, it takes 5 years before they harvest. And so you have all these farmers like making massive bets, saying like, I'm betting someone will buy my cultivated rhodiola 5 years from now, and I've never grown this before. And the groups in Canada are doing a really beautiful job of scaling this thing, but still, like, the volumes aren't massive to the point where everyone can switch. And so that's part of our mission, is like, yeah, we could stop buying rhodiola, but we'd actually want to support the cultivation effort and try and get it big enough so the much bigger herb companies can switch over their supply to Canada. But it is tricky. Like I think when an herb gets popular, it's really helpful to look at, okay, where is it coming from? Is it wild? And how is it protected? And you know, certifications like Fair Wild are great, but they're still in their nascency. Fair Wild is mostly bigger commodity wildcrafted herbs at this point. It's not the little guys or the more niche herbs or the ones that are in more difficult countries like China.
Yeah. And that's kind of like a problem of like scale too, because like I can grow, I've been growing rhodiola in the garden, and we talked to Rosemary Gladstar, and that's one of the plants that she's really excited about now because she's been growing it and it's been doing really well. But you know, that's good for like me and my group. But like when you're on the scale that you're on, or on the scale that, like, you know, Celestial Seasonings is on, like where like it's really difficult. Like it's a lot easier. You have a lot more maneuverability as like a community herbalist. But yeah, that scaling up is so I commend you for that, for trying to do that and succeeding.
And there's a lot of philosophical tension, you know, in the herb world. Like if we all, because at times in my life I've been like, we should all just be bioregional herbalists. But the amount of herbalists in places like Colorado and Portland, like pretty soon none of the local trails have any plants on them. And you know, it's like our population no longer supports this type of very, very local herbalism at scale. And at the same time, I don't want to totally be against international trade. Like the herb trade has been going on for thousands of years. Like it is in good ways, and also really colonial ways, really bad ways that need to be unworked. But
I mean, it's kind of the oldest, one of the oldest trades. Like the Silk Road, it was also, I mean, they, you know, traded silk, but also all of the spices and herbs. I always
teach a 3-class series at the herb school in Colorado on herbs of commerce, and one of the things I always say at the end is like, oh, okay, now you're all extremely overwhelmed and depressed and you don't trust anyone, but like just start with one plant. Like what's an herb, one plant that you don't have a physical relationship with, like you're not growing in your garden, you're not sourcing locally. Like what's an herb you use a lot that you don't have a relationship with, and try and learn everything you can about it. Email all the companies that you may buy from and try to get as much information from them as possible, and do a bunch of research and understand like, okay, maybe I want to buy this in a very different way, or maybe I want to not buy it at all. And maybe I want to grow it. Like, good for you, Isaac. I tried to grow rhodiola in Colorado, but it was not, I've not yet mastered it.
Tell him about the Tortuga bed.
Oh, well, I got the seeds from Strictly Medicinal, and he suggested doing these like Tortuga bed. It's like a rock bed. And so I'm growing it in the rock bed basically. And I mean, of all the I just started one packet. I only have like 2 seedlings that, I mean, that made it after all of that. So it wasn't a great, but I'm finding with, even with like Codenopsis, like I started with one packet, got a couple seedlings, and then from those seedlings, then I got thousands of seeds, and then, grew it up.
in a greenhouse. Because I have a packet of Codenopsis. We're just waiting. It's tempting me this spring, but I have not yet. But you need a greenhouse, right?
No, Codenopsis is hardy to zone 5 at least.
Okay. Wow.
Yeah. I mean, I was growing it down in Pennsylvania, and then up here in New York, it's wintered at least 2 winters. So.
All right. Amazing.
Yeah. I think I learned about most of these herbs from Joe Hollis. He's got some really good videos on YouTube about cultivating like a lot of those Chinese herbs. I mean, Codenopsis is so amazing. It's a really cool herb.
Yeah, one of my favorites. Sweet and demulcent and gentle, nourishing. Yeah.
Love all those things.
Got a really cool flower too. It's like this little bellflower type of thing.
I've seen pictures. When I was in China, a lot of the adaptogens come from what used to be Manchuria and like the 3 northeasternly states. And it's there's a big mountain range up there called Chiangbaishan, Everwhite Mountains. And I was up there almost exclusively, but a lot of the Codenopsis, for instance, grows in southern China. So I've yet to see that one in person.
Yeah, it's always different to to meet the plants.
Not yet, but you've got the seeds, so it's just a matter of time.
Yeah, I found they didn't have great germination, but if you can get a couple to grow, then each of those like plant will have thousands of seeds, and from those then.
Amazing.
Yeah, but you only get like 100 or so, but it's
like ashwagandha, right? Like that mine seeded out last year and just tons and tons of seeds.
Yeah.
And
Our
so easy to grow.
Our ashwagandha did great. I was actually surprised because I'm like, well, usually is like, think of it as grown in India and like these hot climates, but it did fine here. And
it's just like a tomato.
Your withanolide content is probably really sad though, because in India it's an incredible crop. It's drought. It's not just drought resistant. It's drought loving.
Oh wow!
So if you can basically, I was in a 25-acre ashwagandha farm, over 1 million plants.
Cool. Wow!
Just basically broadcasting seeds, and then you come back 6 months later and you hope it doesn't rain. Like it doesn't like fertilizer.
Really?
It doesn't like water. It has no real pest pressure. And so you just leave it, and the less rain it gets from rainfall, the better, the higher the withanolide content.
Well, we're getting a hoop house set up, and so we're planning on putting it in there. So have a longer season, but we can also regulate how much water it gets.
So you're just saying don't water it.
Yeah, when I harvested it's only a 6-month crop too, so it's awesome for farmers. But I harvested one of my ashwagandha plants from my garden, which it was getting watered along with my squash, and it's getting watered all the time, and it was this just tiny little, like almost nothing. And, like, compared to, for the folks on video, like this is an ashwagandha root from India, and it's there's a world of difference.
Yeah,
that was bigger than any of the ones we've
for sure
so far. Yeah, wow,
very cool. Well, we're coming up on our hour, so out of respect for your time, I think we should probably wrap up. So is there any other last thoughts you'd like to share with our listeners? And of course, tell us, where we can find more about you and your work and about Rasa.
Yeah. Well, if you're not offended by how I talked about coffee, I have a discount code, Cunning15, Cunning all caps and then 15, for 15% off, and give Rasa a try if you want. Cool. And you can find us at wearerasa.com or We Are Rasa on all the socials.
Perfect. Awesome.
Yeah.
Well,
Thanks so much for having me on. This was really fun. I feel like we could probably talk for a couple more hours.
yeah. When I
Yeah.
looked at the clock, I was like, oh, snap. We still have so many questions, but we'll just have to maybe have you back on sometime.
Lovely.
Cool. All right. Thanks, Ben. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.